Hey everybody, welcome to another video. I know it's been a while, but I had a couple of things I wanted to talk about. Maybe I'll get into them briefly in this video. I try not to make it this long, rambly, hour-long thing, but it'll probably become this hour-long, rambly thing. I've been talking about this with a friend of mine around my age, and talking with a couple of my buddies that are right around my age, and just to give some context to that, we're all Gen Xers. Most of us just passed 50, and now we're looking at the wrong side of 60. We were 80s kids, and we went to high school in the late 80s, and then, went to college in the early 90s, so some of us did. Anyways, so that just gives you the context and the age I'm talking about. And what I'm going to say, obviously if you read the whatever you call it, the description already by now, I'm probably going to say some stuff that's probably going to piss some people off. I'm just saying right off the bat, I'm probably going to piss off YouTube, I'm probably going to piss off the algorithm, and I'm probably going to, offend some people. But I'm not trying to. I'm just saying this is my observation. You got to remember, I'm from a different time than young people today. So, I'm just going to talk about my observations over the years, and whether or not this pisses people off or not, or I use the wrong politically incorrect words. I don't care, because I'm of the age where I just don't care. So the video will probably get pulled anyway, so I'm not even really worried about that. And you guys can fire all the hate mail and hate towards me too. I don't really care. But I want to talk about what I call the rise of the adult retard. And what I mean by that is, and again, I'm not trying to use the word retard. Well, I am using it derogatory, but I'm not trying to pinpoint specifically anybody's mental health, or mental disposition. I'm just using it as like a blanket term. It's kind of like calling things gay back in the 80s, where we didn't mean it was homosexual, it just meant it was gay. Or you called a bunch of kids a fags, even they weren't gay, you just called them that. I know Bill Burr's talked about this. There's other comedians right around my age that have talked about what we used to say, which is not, politically correct today, or woke, or whatever you want to call today. We're going into the Trump presidency, and I'm not going to get political in this. We're going into the Trump presidency, and it seems like things are kind of swaying towards anti-woke more so now, I think, because it's cool, because that's the winning team and everybody wants to be on the winning team. But like I said, I call this the rise of the adult retard, and if I was to pinpoint a date, my buddies and I have kind of argued about when we think it started. I'm going to say like 1998. My one friend made a specific reference to the second it would be the third Woodstock, but it was the first Woodstock, I think, was in '94. The first, I think it was a 25-year anniversary from the Woodstock in the '60s, and then they had that's with all the mud craziness. They had all the mud and everything, and then there's the second new Woodstock, which would have been the third Woodstock. It was in '99, and he kind of pinpoints that period. Me personally, I would put it back to say the Lollapalooza and the grunge, but I guess that was still kind of, I don't think the adult retard really was a thing at that time. So this is also the time, if you watch professional wrestling, that the Attitude Era came about, and people and wrestling went really Wild Westy at that time. And remember, I used to watch WWF. Yes, it was called WWF back in AWA. And all those that wrestling with my dad when I was young, I'm talking in elementary school and into junior high. By the time high school hit, I went to WrestleMania 3 at Pontiac Silverdome. I was there 17th row from the ring. But once I got into high school, I realized that wrestling was pretty gay. And my dad still loved it, and the only reason I really kind of semi-paid attention to it into the 90s is because my dad would always, and one of those things where I'd go see my dad for a weekend, or just an afternoon, and he's like, hey, I taped the new wrestling, you want to watch it? All right. That's when the NWO and Hollywood Hogan and all that stuff was popular, and that kind of that kind of led into that time period I'm talking about. So in wrestling terms, it was the rise of the adult retard. In music terms, this is kind of when like the new metal started to kick in, and bands like Korn and Disturbed, Slipknot, as I call them, Lincoln Biscuit, Limp Bizkit. Lincoln Park was actually more like 2001, but it, like I said, this bled over the turn of the century. And this is when like I just started looking at the people that started to like were into this music. I'm like going, there's something wrong with these people. And same thing with like wrestling. I just looked at like people who were really into wrestling at the time, and I thought, is there something wrong with these people? And then I guess, it bleeds over into a lot of different things, not just wrestling and music, but it bled over into, I mean, I guess sports kind of always was in sports somewhat, not really. But I think it also bled into like, I'm trying to think about it. Well, except specifically the rise of anime and manga, especially in the 90s. I mean, that became a huge thing. I mean, when I was getting into manga and anime, it wasn't called that, for one thing. It was just called Japanese animation, and the manga was just called Japanese comics. And it was like in the late 80s when I was in high school, and, when like Akira, or Akira, as it's pronounced, became popular. Bubblegum Crisis. I'm trying to think of all the stuff at that time. This is before like even Cowboy Bebop. So I think as it picked up into the early 90s, but definitely by the mid 90s, and definitely by the time I'm talking about the late 90s, it became huge. And it's still huge today. If arguably anime and manga is more popular than Western comics or Western animation, I'd say it's a little beyond arguable. It's probably objective at this point. Which takes in more money, which one's more popular. And that's when I started to see, like I said, I used to go to comic book conventions in the 80s, and I would say that adult retard was there, but I was young too, and it just seemed just like, oh, these are just older geeks, is what I just consider them. Like, these are older nerds, older dorks, and they were there, and then, but people like my age at those conventions was pretty rare. I mean, there might have been like a handful of high school kids at a comic book convention in the late 80s. Into the 90s, it became more of a thing, and you'd see more younger kids, even younger than that, like elementary school kids. I think a reason a lot of parents wouldn't let their elementary kids go to a comic book convention in the late 80s was because of the questionable people there, and they thought that there'd be adult predators. Remember, this is the 80s. I mean, adult predators were pretty, the crime rate was high in then. I mean, I think 87 was the highest, was the crime rate, and like murder rate, like kidnappings. I think that was like the highest in 87 that's ever been in history of the United States. I don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that's, if you look up the facts, it's probably pretty close to that. So I could see why people are like, no, you're not going, little Billy at 8 years old is not going to a comic book convention with a bunch of adult, bearded, fat men that smell funny, who may or may not abduct my son. So into the 90s, it seemed like it became more of a thing where you had younger people going. And obviously today, San Diego Comic-Con, it's so huge. But I mean, that stuff was, to think that that's what things would have came to back then, I wouldn't have called it. I would have totally lost money on that bet. I'm like, no, talking about comic book conventions being like these rock star, cultural phenomenons that like, thousands and thousands of people going to. If I was to put money on it back in, say, 1989, 88, or maybe even 1990, I'd say, no, it's not a thing. Boy, was I wrong. And of course I lived through the, and one of the reasons I kind of got out of comics was because of the 90s speculator buzz. And again, comic books, even Western comic books, we're talking, the rise of Image. And if you read the comics of Image Comics, or you looked at what was popular in Image Comics, I would say that was the start of the adult retard. I'm not saying that Rob Liefeld specifically is an adult retard, but you know what I'm talking about, where it's just like, things are cool that are like not really that cool. I mean, or it's like, sorry, like Carnage and Venom and all that stuff got really popular in that time period for Marvel. DC was still kind of living off the fame of the Watchmen and Sandman and the Dark Knight. So everybody's trying to get a hold of me all of a sudden. Anyways, when it rains, it pours, right? So, like I said, that's when all of that started to come to play. And then by the mid to late 90s, I'm looking at comic books. I'm like, what is this shit? Right? It just looks stupid. You know, you watch wrestling, God, this looks stupid. Maybe it's because I was starting to become an adult at the time. You know, I mean, I turned 21 in 94. So by 98, 99, I was what, in my mid to late 20s? Mid-20s? Yeah, mid to late 20s. And like I said, I started seeing music watching like MTV was still a thing back then. I'd watch these bands, I'm like, what is this shit? You know, that whole South Park skit where everything, it's like all new music starts to just sound like literally the sound of shit. That's kind of what I was starting to think. It's like, this is not, I don't like this, But it seemed to be very popular. And then you'd go to I went to a Limp Bizkit show with a girlfriend at the time at the top of the Phoenix Plaza in Pontiac. And it was just like looking around at these people and like going, these people are weird. Like, a lot of dudes that are just like roided up, like covered in tattoos, shaved heads, and they're so like ready to kill you. And I'm just like, is this really the place to be? And it's just like they were just totally like loving whatever this shit was going on the stage. And, I mean, if we were to see like a band like Limp Bizkit back in like the late 80s, early 90s, we would have watched it ironically. And of course, that also clues me into, the whole, everything's just became ironic. People would watch things ironically. I think that was more of a late, the end of the Gen X period into like the early millennials, I think, where people thought things were cool ironically. I don't think that's really a thing today, because I look around like Gen Z and Gen Alpha and all those kids. Like my son's going to be turning 13 here in a couple of weeks, and I'm like, I don't think they like things ironically. I mean, outside of like Skibbity Toilet and weird things like that, where it's just like, I don't think they're looking at this ironically, like as in like, ha 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 ha. I think they're like, oh, I just like this, which is creepy. Which also leads me into, I think the adult retard has gone like supernova at this point. So yeah, and if you look at, I'm not trying to specifically pick on people per se. I'm not dissing you like as in you're, stupid for liking this stuff. But I mean, it's just, to me, growing up and also being into a lot of this stuff, with comics and gaming and stuff, science fiction and all this stuff, as a young kid, coming into it, being a nerd of the 80s, going into nowadays and seeing stuff like, and this isn't even new, this is like a 10-year-old phenomenon, like the bronies and all that stuff, and I'm just like, and furries and all this stuff, and it's like that stuff started to pick up steam in the late 90s into the 2000s. The bronies thing obviously became a thing more so, well, whenever they came out with the show, the Friendship is Magic show. I'm just like going like, people are getting really weird. And like I said, the only thing I could give it to it in my 80s kid, Gen X, sarcastic, what do you call it, verbiage, or, the nomenclature would be, adult retard. And I'm not saying I'm not one myself, right? I'm not discluding myself. I've done stuff, and I've been into stuff that I would personally myself stamp as that's adult retard. I'm trying to think of things. I mean, I guess still reading comic books today. I still play video games here and there. I'm not huge into video games. I mean, I grew up with Atari and ColecoVision, so if I'm playing like arena shooters online now on Steam is like, we're talking, I'm living in, Jetsons era at this point. And I'm not really into it just because it just doesn't really appeal to me. I liked not being able to pause, or not being able to pause the. Actually, I loved being able to pause the game when like the NES came out. You had the start button. You could pause the game and go pee. I loved that. But I mean, not being able to save a game, saving your progress, having to brutally play Contra all in one night, even with the cheat code of the up, up, down, down, left, right, A, B, start. You know, to get the extra 30 guys. I mean, that was like. I liked that. Nowadays, it's just like I go on and I play like Fortnite and I just get my ass handed to me because I have a bad internet connection speed, or I'm playing it on PlayStation 4 and I'm not playing it on PlayStation 5. So, you know, I'm totally at the mercy of people with better internet connections and faster systems because it's all cross-gen, and then I'm at mercy to PC players over console players. It's like, oh my God. Talk about overwhelming. It's just like, I didn't think, you know, like I said, if you went back and talked to, you know, 15-year-old me, I would not have thought, like, yeah, you know, in your 50s, you're going to be so overwhelmed by the choice of shit that's out there that you're literally going to, you know, implode and crawl back into, you know, your own self because you can't, because it's just so overwhelming. I never would have thought that. So, again, you know, not to make this video super long and not to, like I said, I'm right off the bat. I tried to say it at the beginning, I'll say it again now. I'm not specifically trying to attack anybody. You know, I'm not doing this out of maliciousness. I'm saying this out of just a basic observation of somebody at my age who's grown up with the stuff that I've grown up with at the certain time that I grew up in, looking at today and looking at, say, the last 20, I guess it would be 25 years, because let's just make it easy. Let's just say 2000, the turn of the millennium. You know, like I said 98, my friend said 99. Let's just say 2000. If you took 2000 to today, it's 2025. You know, it's 25 years. We're working on 26 years now. So, in the last 25 years, I would say just the rise of just people being just like off. People are just off. That's all. I guess retard is a derogatory term, and apologize for using it to anybody who takes offense to it. Let's just say weird adults or people that are off. And again, I'm not excluding myself from that group because I definitely belong to that group. I'm not going to say they're my brethren. Like, oh, I feel so, because I feel also very alienated, and so because of my age, so kind of kicked out of that community. Because I do look at things differently, and I do look at things as like, this is a little weird, right? But some people who are younger than me are like, this is normal. You know, I talked to my son, he's like, well, this stuff's all normal now. I'm like, so I don't fit into that community. And because there was so little of us back in my generation, meaning you really were an outcast, you really were considered weird to be into the stuff that I was into, say, post-elementary school. You know, being into comic books and gaming into junior high and high school was pretty not cool. So there's not that many of those people. Plus, there's not many. I think the millennials is the biggest generation, like as in like the most amount of people. Like, I don't think there's that many Gen Xers. And if you took that, a very small handful of them were considered weird or nerds or geeks or whatever. Like I said, all of these I find to be offensive. I mean, you know, when somebody says like, oh, hey, the word retard is offensive. Okay. But I also find when people say, I'm a geek girl, or it's geek culture, I find that offensive. Because when I was young, being a geek was not a good thing, and you were ostracized for it. And to see it just used so flippantly nowadays, and so like matter of fact, as in like, oh, we're all geeks, so we're geeking out. It's just, to me, that's offensive. But nobody cares what people of my age think. You know, it's all about young, hip people and what they think. So, because us old fuckers, you know, and that's the other thing is like, people always lump us into, I'm not going to get into the generation thing, but younger people lump like me into like the boomers. I'm like, that's my parents. I'm not a boomer. Actually, my dad was the last year of the previous generation, which I think was the silent generation. I can't remember. My mom was like, because I think it was 45 and higher. If you're born 1945 or higher, my dad was born in 43. You were considered a boomer. So 45 to 64, I think, is boomers. My mom was born in 46, so my mom was a boomer. My dad wasn't. So my dad was actually skipped a generation, just like I'm skipping a generation of my son. My son was the last year of Gen Z, and I'm a Gen Xer. So technically, his parents should have been, you know, what do you call it? A millennial, but they're not. You know, so. I had my kid late in life. So, again, if you could come up with a better term for it, I know that adult retard comes across pretty mean. But, you know, that's just how we spoke back then. You know, we didn't know what autism was. We didn't know what the spectrum was. We didn't know what Asperger's were. You know, to us back in the day, there was like normal people and retards. That was it. So, you know, so if you can come up with a better term for it, whatever you want to call it, I'm sure, you know, every generation after me has got it. If you're a gooner or you're all these different, like, words, these internet speak words, all this stuff born out of, like, I say born out of 4chan. I'm probably dating myself, too, because that's not even really a thing anymore, is it? All, you know, anything basically born out of the internet culture, you guys can come up, if you're of that ilk, come up with a better name for what I'm describing. But I have a sense that people who are in that age group don't know what I'm talking about. Like, what's he talking about? I don't get it. What do you mean adult retard? That's offensive. I don't even know what that means. But I think people in my generation, I think Gen Xers, maybe older first-gen millennials, be like, I know what he's talking about. Because they saw it firsthand. And I saw it firsthand. Actually, I think if you were born in 81, you're first generation millennial. When did you graduate high school? 99? So you graduated high school right at that time. That started to become a thing. But I think it was the seeds of it were growing in the late 90s. So even if I guess only people are really going to know what I'm talking about are Gen Xers, and probably not even the end Gen X. Like I said, if you were born in like 80 or 79, you're the last year Gen X. That means you graduated high school in like the mid to late 90s. Unless you were like actively watching it, you probably fall into that category too. So even the end of Gen X probably doesn't see this. Now, if you talk to my sister was born in 65. She's first year Gen Xer, right? So she's turning 60 soon. This year, as I'm turning 52 this year, she's turning 60 this year. For one thing, she wouldn't agree with, because she disagrees with everything I say anyway, so she would think that I'm just being a dick, or being like, oh, that's not how people were. But I don't think that's just my sister, you know, being like don't think that way. I think that's more, I think it's more her like her literal age group, but probably like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I think people like right around my area, like the mid Gen Xers, you know, people born, I'd say, from like 1971 to like 1975. I think we know, because like I said, we've already got through high school by the time the 90s hit. You know, or me, I graduated in 91, so we just got out of high school. And we started and as we got into our 20s, we just saw how the world started changing and getting weird. So we would have seen it. So I guess I'm speaking to a very small demographic right now. For reasons that I mentioned about us being a very small amount of people on this earth at this moment. So, all right, like I said, say whatever you want to say about the generation. You know, let me know. You know, if you got a better word for it that's not as derogatory, give me your ideas. I'll rename it something else. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can always, you know, ask for more clarification, you know, or if you think I'm just full of shit, or you want to do my sister thing and just wave your finger, you shouldn't think like that, it's not healthy, then you could do that too. Trust me, I've got a lot of this in my life, so you waving your finger at me saying like, oh, you're a bad person. I've gotten a lot of that, so I'm not really, really fazed by any of it. But yeah, let me just know what you think, and I'll try to get back to you and answer you, and maybe I'll try to do a follow-up video once I see what people say. Or, as my other videos are, nobody pays attention to this, and I'll get 33 views. One of them or two of them will be my friends. So I'll be in that situation. I think my last video I had 33 views. One before that almost had 1,000. Woo! Just because I agreed with Rick Beato, and of course Rick Beato has a following, so people probably just clicked on me because it popped up when his video popped up. Yeah, let me know what you think, and I'll get back to you on that. All right, bye bye.